Welcome, my dear friends and colleagues from across the globe joining me here today. My name is Tim Mikilishvili, and I'm your host, CEO, and co-founder of Amadea Pharma, an analytics management consulting agency that helps life science organizations in pharma and medical devices improve their team performance and engagement using novel platforms and communication playbooks that reward both sportsmanship and scientific thinking. A little bit about me. I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for about 18 years now as a doctor of pharmacy, first in medical education and publication departments at a large global pharmaceutical company, before switching over into primarily field medical affairs and training roles for the remainder of my career, in which my job has been to learn from and teach some of the leading scientific thought leaders and experts in medicine, researchers, and clinicians, and to connect them to various company educational and research activities. And as I reflect back on my career, I was never trained as a basic science researcher. However, I came in with the intentions of identifying new gaps and continuing to bring ideas to my teams, regardless of whether or not they were implemented, how popular they were, or how they were perceived by many. And therefore, the mission of Amadea Pharma is to help life science organizations generate innovation, quality, and continuity in healthcare. Because the business and healthcare environments are extremely competitive. And we need to learn how to design the new contests that matter, that enable us to both quantify and combine performance and behaviors in ways that can allow us to show and grow the value of our medical affairs teams across the industry. So today I'm very excited about sharing with you an encore presentation from the second annual Medical Affairs Digital Transformation Summit, which took place in May in Philadelphia. And I believe that it'll spark some ideas from many of you. And so after you watch this presentation, if you'd like to continue the conversation, make sure to contact me at my email, which appears below along this ticker on the bottom here, timmick@amadeapharma.com. I would love to continue our dialogue. Again, timmick@amadeapharma.com. So today I am streaming live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. However, I'll start with a confession that I'm also a proud owner of the BlackBerry phone, the LTE Key 2 BlackBerry phone that runs on Android. And it's not because I seek attention and I want to be different, but because of the context that its keyboard and the phone has for me. It shortens the distance from me to the phone because of the keyboard, which trains my muscle memory, and I make less errors typing using it. And also, there is a community of us to which I belong. Yes, a community, a small community, probably in the thousands in the United States, not in the millions. But the way I evaluate this phone personally extends beyond attention alone and includes the context of its use and also the community to which I feel that I belong. And so these three are the topics that I'll be focusing in on throughout my presentation. And to challenge all of us to advance our understanding of metrics from gaining attention alone, which is an important objective. We use metrics and we communicate them in order to grab attention and to get the appropriate attention for our activities, our efforts, or those of our teams and recognition. But we want to also be able to grab a larger share of context and also build a community as well. So let's start with grabbing attention using updated norms of communication, because how we communicate and we collaborate is an important factor, an element of the attention that we receive. And so, speaking of attention, I'd like to start with this image. Take a look at this picture. It's intended to grab your attention because it represents innovation in mobility. A self-driving car that interprets terabytes of data at every given millisecond on the physical objects in the immediate vicinity, tire traction, weather, and traffic conditions in order to prevent accidents and take over the control of the steering wheel automatically when appropriate. Well, that is a perception. However, the reality is that it's not always accurate. In fact, I tested it myself. I shot a YouTube video a couple of years ago in which I demonstrated that for this one car manufacturer, which I will not name, the lane shift sensors using self-driving technology worked only about 2/3 of the time. So what, you may ask, what does this have to do with medical affairs and pharma industry and metrics? Well, medical teams in the pharmaceutical industry usually use pictures like this or images like this to demonstrate their value, which leaves a lot to interpretation and sometimes too much. The way that really plays out in the real world is that many of our activities or actionable insights are not communicated in a timely manner with other functions such as sales and marketing because of fear of debate or for how they may be perceived. We succumb to the notion that perception is reality. Well, the perception is no longer reality because reality is more exposed than ever before because of the increased volume, velocity, and variety of data and how it travels. So we run the risk of increasing unneeded potential adverse events or inefficiency, interdepartmental rivalries as a result of these principles that we've become too accustomed to, in my opinion. And also, we do not communicate the value that medical affairs truly brings to our organizations. Well, our communications are limited largely in part because of the restrictions that we have created for the last few decades for ourselves between medical and commercial. Medical is indicated here in this diagram that I created as MSLs, right? Medical science liaisons. There's others in medical as well. However, medical allows physicians to identify the appropriate patients for the treatments, right? However, sales or commercial helps physicians or scientists secure access to their patients, without which no care or no health benefits can be validated, right? And so the reason why I drew this diagram is to explain that ultimately, whether or not we're in medical or we're in sales, we converge in this continuum of healthcare. However, we don't always communicate it as such, and we miss a lot of important insights in the process that are critical. When we do not know where our actionable insights in medical end up, whether or not they're followed up by commercial, which is the case in 3/4 of the time, or about 75% of the time, according to data, that really demotivates us, right? That may decrease the level of engagement or communication between departments. And so metrics play an integral role in engagement, which we have to recognize. Attention is something that all of us, whether or not we're medical or we're in sales, something that we all seek. Whether or not we're 5 years old or we're 85 years old, we want to have that share of voice. We want to have a sense of belonging, that our input has some significance. And also, metrics represent a strategy, an important strategy that allows us to communicate and recognize our efforts as well. awards or tuition, career progression, and feedback. So metrics is a way of communicating feedback. And so that communication is what really unites all these three business leaders, tremendous business leaders that revolutionized and changed those norms of communication in their respective organizations to transform them ultimately. Bill Gore at W.L. Gore Associates, a company that has reported profit for 6 decades without one annual loss ever reported. He came in and he created a structure in which there was only CEO and no hierarchy whatsoever. And he required every employee to rank 20 to 30 other employees and matched every employee with a sponsor, not just a mentor, but a sponsor who was incentivized by making that new hire successful. Okay. Very importantly, the performance bonuses did not differentiate between employees who were more or less tenured as well. And so this is one example, and there are many others, right? Paul Polman, for example, at Unilever, he came in and he decreased the numbers of intersections between different departments. The levels of hierarchy from 11 were decreased to 5. And he created 300% increase in profit and increased sustainability in this global consumer goods company. James Rhee came into Ashley Stewart, a company that was failing, that could barely keep up its inventory, which lacked sanitary conditions. And he allowed his employees to promote their stores using their personal social media accounts. And he was able to demonstrate profit for the first time in a company that was on the verge of going bankrupt. Speaking of engagement, before the pandemic, and more recently in 2020, McKinsey released a report that demonstrated a large deficit and difference between business owners and executives and rank and file employees. The engagement levels across different industries were at 85% among executives compared to 15% among rank and file employees. Well, throughout the pandemic, we've learned to work remotely. And the different trends as the restrictions have now lifted are suggesting a similar difference in which it's really the business owners and the executives who are urging and who are eager to go back to the home office. Whereas the employees, most of the employees, when surveyed, about 2/3 of them prefer work flexibility or to work remotely at least part of the time. And so the great revelation here that I propose may be not that we have learned to become more productive using virtual modes of communication, but maybe it's because we still feel like we are not really engaged or included in those decisions that matter. Because if business owners describe the companies as families, if you were a family member or felt as such, wouldn't you rush back to the home office when the restrictions from the pandemic are lifted? So it's something for us to think about in order to close this gap in engagement by really revisiting our norms of communication. So our norms of communication and the metrics the expectations that we have play an important role in not only engagement, but they're intimately connected with the workflow. Metrics impact workflow, which in turn influences our outcomes and the expectations that we have and that we create ourselves. So this is just a hypothetical example. that can demonstrate that if you spend more time capturing and planning your activities rather than executing them in the real world, you probably need to revisit those processes, that workflow. Because what you have to aim to do is to potentially communicate those activities to a greater extent. Spend less time planning and potentially invest or implement new technology that can cut down the time needed to capture those activities so that you're able to spend more time with customers, with physicians, getting those insights. Right? So 2 years ago, in November of 2020, I decided to study just how productive we are virtually. And I surveyed my global medical affairs colleagues across all continents, this world. And after receiving 271 responses over the period of 2 weeks, we presented this data at the DIA global meeting recently in Chicago and demonstrated that there may be this virtual productivity threshold above which we're no longer productive. And in this particular study, the number of virtual meetings was 3. So those who engaged in less than 3 meetings seemed to have and spend more than 50% longer in what they assess themselves as deep, uninterrupted work. Well, going from virtual productivity to virtual creativity, there is a new study that was recently published by Nature, in Nature, which was an elegant attempt at studying eye movements as well as recorded conversations among people who were either in-person meetings or were involved in virtual meetings. And it demonstrated that in-person meetings can generate more creative ideas, more interruptions between participants compared to virtual meetings in which eye movements were lacking. People tended to focus on each other more, not pick up cues from their environment as much, and also not to diverge their ideas. As you see here in the scatter plot at the right, forward flow of ideas was defined as lack of semantic similarity, which was more present among those in in-person meetings. So those in virtual meetings tended to keep those ideas along the same vein more, and were not awarded as the top winning ideas. However, interestingly, virtual format may increase the quality of decisions, according to this study. So what this really means is not that we should decrease our virtual meetings, but it's really how we apply those virtual meetings, for what reason. Similar to how I use this BlackBerry phone today in 2022, meaning that if you have a brainstorming meeting, maybe you should not require your employees to be on camera. You should let them get up and move. That's when some of the most innovative ideas come. So one of the most valuable pieces of information that we share in medical are insights. These medical insights that turn into business insights and have business impact as well. And usually they're not very well defined, and which may sometimes cause a high noise to signal ratio, which may become problematic in a big company where you have thousands of insights that you have to sift through. So in one of our brainstorming sessions in previous startup that was very successful, we came up with a new definition, a little bit more strict definition of what insights were across these 3 different domains that you see here. Investigational use, real-world evidence after a treatment is launched, for example, and is on the market, and unpublished intelligence, which may be disease-related, a burden of illness, or territory transitions of various different scientists across different academic institutions, guidelines changes, which may overlap with one or the other. However, this is an attempt at really decreasing that noise overall, and also increasing actionability, or likelihood of actionability of those insights. Now, in the last 4 companies, I've implemented insights processes. And what I've noticed invariably is not only the fact that we don't communicate and don't know where those insights end up, but also the lag time between when we generate those insights to when we capture them, from when we capture them to when we communicate them with each other. And so take a look at this diagram that I drew, which I think depicts that lag time. And if we take a moment and go away from medical affairs, we can think of incidents, tragic incidents, such as the one associated with Boeing a few years ago in the United States, in which those manufacturing problems in the front lines were not communicated appropriately, and by the time they reached management, the disaster became an accomplishment, possibly. And we all know what those insights and what Boeing accidents led to: loss of hundreds of lives, right? And so where that light bulb, right, those insight that is ever so visible in the beginning, it became almost non-existent by the time it could have become actionable. And so this is why this is so very, very critical. Our recall bias also makes that lag time decrease the accuracy of those insights that we bring in. And so what if we were to shorten the distance and that lag time between generation and capture, for example? We could maintain those insights and how visible they are to others, as indicated by this light bulb that it remains ever so prominent. And one way to do that is to utilize various different modes of communication, such as Slack or a smartphone, which is something that I spoke about when I presented insights along with Sourcero to a global medical affairs audience. Sourcero is a natural language understanding advanced analytics company that focuses on life sciences, with whom Amadea Pharma partners. And so we have to think about how to make the communication more fluid across the entire company. Now, our interactions do not always generate insights, and not all insights generate sentiment, and even a smaller proportion lead to actionable insights. And this is why this is an illustration of all the different types of communications that may become valuable in medical affairs organizations. And so when a decision maker, whether it's in medical or in commercial, decides to utilize a dashboard or a database, it needs to be readily accessible. They need to have as few clicks as needed in order to have these additional filters, right? Categories, topics, subtopics that they can get to immediately, where they can learn about not just what a positive or neutral or negative sentiment as it's tagged by the users, but maybe a little bit more detail very quickly that they can get to immediately. Sentiment that could include how relevant it is, a perception that a treatment, for example, may need more data or need improvement, need an alternative, which are listed on the right here. So those details really matter, but they can be implemented using the right tools in order to improve communication that we have. So I'll share with you one memorable case study of a failing startup in which medical affairs identified a gap in the literature, because sometimes these insights do not only come from interactions but also from the literature, our ability to interpret scientific data critically. So we did that. We approached our leadership and management, and it took us about 2 years to convince them. But we ultimately created two late-breaking abstracts that we presented with a global thought leader, one of which captured a lot of attention from Bloomberg and Seeking Alpha for this product that only had one adverse event in its label, but was competing against the market leader and was frustrated. And we, the entire field force and the company was frustrated because the launch didn't have the uptake that it was expected to. Well, as a result, our executive management from commercial and marketing was monitoring the reception among shareholders, among others, of this late-breaking abstract, and they confirmed that it was singled out amongst all presentations at that global meeting, and it increased the evaluation of the company by $40 million as the abstract was being presented, as the poster was being presented for in those 4 hours. So when I share this information with many of my colleagues and leaders, they usually cringe because medical is not there to generate revenue directly. We're there to generate data and disseminate or communicate science, communicate data in order to make sure that the right patient receives the right treatment or device at the right time. However, at the same time, we need to come up with more than just pictures alone, words and numbers in order to communicate the impact, the direct impact that medical affairs can have that spans an entire organization, which it did in this case. So what was also most memorable here, even probably more memorable than the business impact, which also allowed more patients to receive treatment after this abstract among payers and insurance companies, was the one incident that was shared with us medical by our sales colleagues at a Christmas party, who told us that someone in the management had questioned why we posted this on LinkedIn, our late-breaking abstract, simply inviting others to come and visit. And in our absence, sales reps, our colleagues, got up one by one and they supported medical because they knew that we had their best interests. And they gave us comments and feedback that we re-energized the company, which was incredibly fulfilling for many of us in medical. So after I transitioned into my next role from that company, I influenced my leadership to update their social media communications policies. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about why I believe that there's a strong business case for doing that today. Well, data now shows that there has been a significant decrease in the numbers of warning letters from the FDA that pharmaceutical companies and medical device organizations have received. The FDA doesn't have a clear position on social media off-label discussions. And Philip Reveal just presented data at the DIA Global meeting in Chicago last month, demonstrating a 78% lower number of these enforcement letters from DDMAC and Office of Prescription Drug Promotion from the FDA, which really means that we have to not neglect or not ignore compliance, which is critical, but we need to probably take a position which needs to be updated. We need to take a more clear position as a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company in order to stay consistent in terms of our communication with our environment. Attention, grabbing attention using metrics is similar to getting likes from social media, okay? So when we get likes, we don't really know why someone likes it. Is it because they're our friend, they support us, or is it because they genuinely appreciate that information? Or is it because they want something in return, for example, right? So that's why we need to advance the understanding of metrics to grabbing the share of context. Why is it that they're liking or interacting with our information? And the best way to do that may be by designing metrics that inspire future performance and behavior rather than past activities alone. In the most recent webinar, a global audience of medical affairs leaders stated that only 5% of them felt that metrics were meaningful in their organization, which is quite concerning in my estimation. 75% stated that they felt that they were somewhat meaningful. So there's a huge gap that needs to be filled. When we think about metrics, we sometimes think of them as an episode. Okay, I've been asked by my executive to get some data, so I'm going to try to ask for it, right? Instead, metrics have to be managed over time. There should be continuous. And so I have this diagram of a metrics management cycle, which includes 3 important steps. First, all the definitions have to be consistent. Insights have to be clear to everyone in the organization who are impacted by them. That's what I refer to as data integrity or relevance. Once you establish that, you need to make sure that metrics are regularly and frequently analyzed, because the more data you collect, the more accurate they become. And so that allows you to draw correlations or data predictability. But none of this is ultimately valuable until you're able to translate the data into behavior, changes in behaviors, and study those patient outcomes, for example, or KOL outcomes, scientific key opinion leader or scientific expert outcomes. And once you're able to do that, you translate the data in a way that can demonstrate a cause, not just a correlation, about which I'll speak in a little bit. After data translation, all that data gets back into the cycle, and you can then start to design new definitions, and so forth and so on. When we think about how to visualize metrics, many of us really are unclear. And I think it takes us really drawing a picture in our minds to understand, am I able to trace this metric all the way from activity to the outcome? And this is why I attempted to draw this kind of relationship. And let's start with this working definition of metrics. At Amadea Pharma, I define metrics as an estimate of the relationship between an activity and a desired outcome, which may be different for different functions at different times. So if you're measuring a relationship development quality of medical science liaisons in the field by keystrokes, for example, right, by monitoring their keystrokes or duration of their meetings, that may not be relevant as if you were measuring someone in a call center who's expected to spend all of their time in front of their computer. And so when you look at this diagram, you should pay particular attention to level 1 metric. That's what I call level 1 metric, which may or may not describe those activities, may not be relevant. That's an X here on the left, right, which is not even on the path, on the dashed line. A level 2 metric may be predictable because it may be relevant to those activities, but it has question marks. So those are the metrics that have the question marks in this diagram. Publications or medical education programs. If you report the number of publications or posters that you present at a particular meeting or numbers of attendees, that may be relevant to your activity, but you're not validating whether or not they actually changed the outcomes or practice of those physicians who attended or who read those papers. And so those are correlations that you're able to identify. But level 3 metrics allow you to indicate and represent a causation. and follow through those metrics from activities all the way to outcomes by a thumbs up or thumbs down on this diagram. Uh, and those are the kinds of metrics that we want to strive for. I mentioned the word contest before. Well, when we design metrics, we invariably design a contest. And so we have to think of metrics as designing a contest, similar to when we design clinical studies and decide what types of clinical endpoints to include. And the reason why I have a picture of a high jump is because it's a type of contest that honors both competition and sportsmanship equally, in which no performance-enhancing substances confer an advantage, unlike in a 100-meter dash, for example. And world records have stayed for decades in the high jump for that reason. And the way that this relates to medical affairs, once again, is that when you create the types of metrics in which people can undermine each other, but yet receive highest bonuses or high performance rating, you then create a population or a group of cynics who are high performing but who don't believe in the relevance of those metrics. Or when you don't communicate those metrics or the rules for them early enough, and you leave a lot of questions in the minds of those whom you're trying to inspire ultimately. And so it's similar to asking your employees to run a 100-meter dash without telling them where that finish line is. When you don't share with them some of these building blocks of metrics, how is it that you decide those rankings, the tiebreakers? Once there's clarity, there's competition, but it's more explicit and it's healthier for an organization. The gap that continues to exist in our current metrics is that we tend to design those metrics that are externally facing. Attendees, customers, physicians, yes, they're incredibly important, but equally as important, but less represented in our metrics are not just representations of how busy we are, but how we learn and teach each other. So internal training, which can sometimes magnify the effects of any data or any publication, sometimes are not communicated or not focused to the same extent. And non-existent and very close to actually absent, completely absent from our metrics, probably are the concept of translation of those internal or external metrics into relative rankings. How do those activities really translate into an opportunity to get promoted or to receive, let's say, reimbursement for to upskill yourself in a course? That is something that usually is not communicated very transparently. So what that leads to ultimately is a lack of engagement, unnecessary interdepartmental rivalries because of imbalanced metrics across different functions, inappropriate, inaccurate reporting of data as well. So those perspectives and those building blocks are critical on an organizational level when we design metrics. Usually we consider that what's in it for me, for the company. It has to be profitable. It has to be viable. It has to make sure that the pricing strategy is allows for the pipeline to flourish and to advance. For those who don't have insurance, such as veterans, to receive those medications, to have access to them through government contracts, and so forth and so on. Well, if we change those perspectives a little bit, and if we start with the patients first, and then we make sure that there are pathways for them to access those medications through payees and through government, we may really change the kinds of expectations and metrics we design. Because as the life cycle of the product changes, right, advances, Our metrics also undergo a metamorphosis, and this is why metrics should be and is a constantly moving target across the product lifecycle. One very important distinction that many of us forget to make is the one between activities and outcomes. Remember that activities should always precede outcomes when you measure them. So many argue and say, look, I don't need to know about all these activities. I don't need to capture all these activities. Just tell me what the outcomes are. If you only measure outcomes, then you'll be guessing at best in how to replicate those activities that may have led to those outcomes, whether it took 2 months or 2 years, as was the case in that failing startup in which we generated that late-breaking abstract, for example. And so this is why we need to distinguish them from each other and measure activities, the right activities, prospectively, and also keep track of our outcomes retrospectively in order to be able to not just generate guesses or correlations, but to demonstrate a causation, a cause and effect relationship between an activity and an outcome so that you can replicate. So this is what data scientists refer to as prescriptive analytics. So because it'll allow a medical affairs team to potentially improve the sales forecasts even in the future. Because according to data scientists, again, a causation is defined by 2 factors. One, that an activity that you measure has to precede its outcome. And then second, that it cannot be explained by anything else, any other activity that you'll be able to isolate. And so that's my response to those who measure both or define both interchangeably or measure both retrospectively. So after having experience in various different types of companies, specialty companies, those that emphasize metrics, and after observing a lot of very high-performing competitive sales teams that were nevertheless collaborative as well, I reflected on those experiences and wrote an article on metrics, which I called the Medical Productivity Index, that I focused on, which caught the attention of Sorcero and some other companies as well, and has been one of my most popular articles. And so I've written and spoken about this Medical Productivity Index, which is the first case study that I want to talk about here today. It essentially addresses the gaps that I've spoken about by weighing both performance and behavior equally at 50% each, which is the only formula to eliminating those cynics who may not want to participate in those contests or with the same engagement or quality because they don't believe that they're relevant to them, even though they have passion for their work and for the customers and patients and physicians. And also, what's unique about the MPI and what's different, I believe, is that it collects data that ranks different activities according to impact, according to relative impact, and also collects information from internal and external stakeholders in multiple directions. Let's look at this in more detail. 50% of the total MPI is derived from performance, which includes activities that are assigned numerical values which correspond to the frequency, to the relative alignment to strategy for that company, for a company, for example. And so they're numerical values, and they're listed. All the activities are listed, and then they're ranked accordingly. In the numerical part, or in the total MSL points in the field medical affairs case example, outcomes are also measured, these qualitative outcomes. However, they're measured and they're not quantified. They're simply reported. And for those reasons that I just went over. Internal surveys are 1 minute, need only 1 minute to complete. They don't include any open-ended text, and they're collected from not just managers, but all collaborators in the function and across the different functions who are directly impacted by the work that's being evaluated, as well as external physician surveys, KOL surveys collected by a third party, also 1 minute to complete. This is just an illustration of an Excel spreadsheet that we piloted at a startup before, in which formulas were included for various different impact points for all the different activities that could possibly be expected from this function. An interaction, for example, being assigned at 1 point, insight 2, a publication that's authored by a medical affairs employee may be 10 points, for example. You can decide how you want to measure the impact and how you want to assign those points. And in addition, you have to track the outcomes, these qualitative outcomes, which need to also be defined. And we define them as any recurrent, routine, or on-demand activity that involves teaching or learning, an internal or external colleague that changes behavior or strategy. And so when we did that, we significantly cut down the time of that dreaded performance review process, because we had these outcomes ready for anyone to see, our management within the function and across different functions. What do the surveys really assess? Well, you have to think about how you ask those questions. So the 10 questions are all numeric, are assigned numerical values, and on the performance side, your internal colleagues should weigh in on your expertise on territory, on therapeutic area, as well as on the products, how clearly you communicate, how resourceful you are, utilizing all the different types of channels or tools available to you. When collecting feedback from external stakeholders, they probably should be shorter. They have less time, and I considered that. Again, physicians can weigh in on how likely they are to recommend the medical affairs employee to their colleagues, whether or not they feel that the information is clear as well, is accurate as well. Now, on the behavior part of the scoreboard, there's only two components: the external surveys and internal surveys. So the internal behavior surveys evaluate those abstract types of communications and behaviors that nevertheless are extremely valuable and make the difference in long-term retention and engagement as well. How likely is someone to acknowledge a colleague, apologize, change their mind, sign up for a project regardless of how much exposure they receive? These are the types of questions that I've captured here. External behavior surveys from physicians, again, and scientific experts can include their feedback on whether or not they feel like they're respected as an individual, not only as an advisor or a speaker for the company or a KOL, or how comfortable they feel in sharing any data in an unbiased manner, because that's ultimately going to determine how accurate those insights are. So what you can do is you can survey the same types of external stakeholders over time in a territory, or you can utilize different types of strategies on how many and whom you want to survey as well. Ultimately, what does this really mean? How do you apply it? Well, someone who's a high-performing individual who receives the highest performance score but the lowest behavior score from the feedback internally and externally, when they're communicated that information early, at the end of the first quarter, for example, and they see that they're ranked number 2 instead of number 1, which they expected, then they know that they need to improve how they're perceived, how their behavior is perceived by their internal and external colleagues. And so they can then change how they approach their work, right? And so that's what I want to actually show again here. okay, as just a hypothetical example, right? So very often I get asked the question of, well, look, this is a very interesting medical productivity index, but how do you apply it in medical education or other functions? Well, in medical education and in a systematic review of social media delivered educational programs, there is a gap that I've identified. And that gap is that most of social media delivered educational programs that report metrics only confirm what we already know, that social media is an acceptable way to deliver education. Only 2 and 3% describe how those educational programs change patient outcomes or behaviors. And so when we define this new return on education in social media, we need to measure not just the intent to change of a physician who attends our programs, for example, that we receive months down the road or immediately, but we need to follow up afterwards closer to the clinical point of care at various multiple time points, and include various different diverse surveys and formats, other than just social media views, for example, because a view may be defined as 3 seconds. So if somebody only views your medical education program for 3 seconds, does that really mean that they learn, right? So what you can do is you can actually intervene at the beginning of the day, for example, of surgical cases, if you educated surgeons, and ask them about what types of patients they're likely to see that day or that week, the relevant resources that they're going to use. Provide a link to your program beforehand so that you can inspire maybe a change of behavior prospectively. And then after the point of care, after the end of that day of cases or at the end of the week, you can determine what proportion of those patients that were relevant to that program were actually considered and applied based on what that attendee learned from your program. What proportion of those patients had an intervention that applied that program, right? And how did it impact that outcome after the point of care? In publications, okay, let's now shift gears from medical education to publications. The impact factor is a standard, gold standard, that's based on the numbers of citations, based on benchmarks for the previous 2 or 3 years. It does not adjust for types of citations or types of articles. And so I try to close this gap and really create a new publication clinical impact score, which I'm working on behalf of Amadea Pharma for Sorcero. Again, a natural language and understanding company. And this PCIS, or Publication Clinical Impact Score, aims at describing the translational value across the research, across the basic research to clinical spectrum, right? A real world evidence spectrum. In order to, for those who review the literature, to understand how likely is this to be integrated into clinical practice and when, right? And so for this type of score metric, I included the following 5 variables, which do not include the author, because I believe that the research should be independent of their author, regardless of their H index or their status. And so this is a way to make this objective, right? And to include not just the article type and subject type, and not just the numbers of citations, but the citation types, meaning what types of articles are those publications cited in? Is it in a real world, in a randomized clinical control trial, for example, a robust study? As well as recency is another 5th variable that may include 3 subscores as well. So a low score here on the publication clinical impact score does not denote or suggest that you have that the article is irrelevant or not important, but it just means that it may be more suitable for someone in drug discovery and may have a more long-term implications or likelihood of being integrated into clinical practice compared to a publication that has a medium or a high score, which are all relative, not absolute concepts. Again, okay? So those are the other case studies of grabbing that share of context. And the context is similar to getting comments, right? Not just the likes, but receiving comments, which give you a larger glimpse of the motivation behind those likes. Now, having the likes and the comments are important, but it's really when people reshare your content or the information that you share in social media that you really build a community. And you can do the same thing with DeepMetrics as you go from competition to collaboration and innovation as well. So we have to think how to build a featured learning and development community. And when I trained a team of 9 medical science liaisons, a specialty company, I realized that we didn't take advantage of all of our videos, all of our various tools that we had to our disposal. And so I started to discuss them more regularly, more systematically, not only related to performance, but also on leadership and our communication standards. So the key, I think, to learning and development communities are to make them accessible, readily accessible, make them simple, continuous, and ultimately to develop feedback, continuous fluid exchange, and community, really. Those three are the components of a learning management system that is featured rather than is just an episode, where you cross over those business acumen, business skills with current medical affairs standards, which may sometimes restrict us how we communicate with each other. And so in the same way that we have code of conduct training or compliance training, I believe that we need to train ourselves on metrics. And I've developed a 29-page medical affairs metrics workbook that can be customized to various different functions, in which you can assess your own metric score through 10 variables that are numerically evaluated again, which are based on some of the latest modern business management literature. And also, it's an interactive workbook which asks questions about how aligned is this metric, what is its context really, and what's the timing of when you measure it, and the 6 building blocks of metrics that are listed here, and the questions that you need to ask yourself in order to design the kinds of metrics that matter. And so I'll close with this one very memorable moment, I think, from the Tokyo Olympics, which many of you may remember, in which Murtaz Barshim from Qatar was tied with Gianmarco Tamberi of Italy for the top height that they had both cleared. So the judge asked Murtaz Barshim at that point whether or not they wanted to continue to compete with a tiebreaker for the gold. And that's when Murtaz Barshim turned to Gianmarco Tamberi for literally 1 second. And without even receiving a response, he turned back to the judge and he asked, well, can we share 2 gold medals? And I was frustrated and disappointed with that at that instant as a fan and a researcher of competition and various contests, because I wanted to see a clear winner of the gold medal. However, it wasn't until I read in many different articles that they had both been training partners and that they had both endured critical injuries prior to world championship competitions, and that they wanted to demonstrate a message of sportsmanship to the next generation of leaders, that I realized that a different ending couldn't have been possible in this case had it not been for that culture of communication that they had created between the two of them. And this is why I strongly believe that if we are able to create clinical endpoints of abstract measures or variables such as pain through visual analog scores that we validate through our studies, or if musicians are able to relate something as abstract as music with notes in order to replicate those masterpieces, then I think many of us in medical affairs can also use words and numbers rather than pictures to eliminate those misperceptions and to be able to redefine what competition is and what collaboration really is for our generation and the next generation to come. So I hope you found some of these ideas interesting and worth continuing the dialogue. And in the next Amadea Pharma Live, you will hear me describe and preview a new contest that I'll have for you in the fall, which will combine all of these concepts that I talked about here together, and which will be open for all of you to participate in this fall. So stay tuned for that very soon. And I thank you very much again for your participation. And I look forward to your comments and questions, my friends. All the best. Thanks.